Welcome to Big Picture Anatomy. Here's how, during the course of embryonic development, the basic plan for our human body is put together. We start right around day 7 of embryonic development, looking at our 2-layer embryo. This is now really something that hasn't grown since the egg was originally fertilized 7 days ago and consists of nothing more than just the 2 flat layers of epithelial cells, an outer ectodermal layer and an underlying endodermal layer. Somewhere right around day 7, we also get a new structure forming called the notochord, which forms the midline dorsal part axis of the body, forming from the tail end to the head end and really defining that long axis of the body. We draw these things in blue for the ectoderm, yellow for the endoderm, and green for the notochord, just so that we can then trace their future fate as the embryo develops. In reality, in the embryo itself, they're clear. We then see a few days later that we start to get what we call the 3-layer embryo. We have the start of the neural tube stimulated by the notochord to roll off of the overlying ectoderm and form a tube all along the length of the embryo. Here we're just seeing it cut in cross section, but this would be running along the length of the embryo. And that neural tube eventually is going to go on to form the spinal cord and the brain. Much later on during fetal development, the notochord itself will go on to form the intervertebral discs, and the rest of it will fill in with bone to form those vertebral bodies. We also see a new layer, a kind of stuffing, a type of connective tissue or mesenchyme with cells in a matrix forming between the ectoderm and the endoderm, forming a kind of sandwich with the ectoderm and endoderm on the outside and the mesoderm in the middle, all along the length of the embryo. The next thing that happens is called gastrulation, and it's sometimes said to be certainly one of the most important and most complicated events in our lives. This whole 3-layer embryo rolls up into a tube from both sides, and that's how we eventually get what we call our tube within a tube basic body plan. What happens when we pull in the 2 sides of this embryo is that we now get our basic tube within tube design that we can see here. This is now with the 2 sides rolled in. And you can see where you've now formed a whole tube. The 2 sides have been pulled around, and you now have a complete tube of ectoderm around the outside with some of its underlying mesoderm. Running down the middle, you've got a complete tube of endoderm with its surrounding mesoderm, and you can see I've now extended this out into 3 dimensions as if you're looking towards the tail end of the embryo. The neural tube along the midline is running all the way back into the tail. We've cut the body across here in the middle in cross section, and just under the neural tube is the notochord, also running all along the length of the embryo to the tail, and of course it would continue on up to the head, as would the neural tube. The endodermal inner tube is what we call the digestive tube or the gut tract, and it runs back towards the tail end and meets the outer tube at the anus, which will eventually become where feces are expelled from the adult body. That endoderm would run to the head end and meet the outer tube at the mouth, or really right at the start of the esophagus. The inner tube and the outer tube are separated by a space that we call the coelom, which will become the body cavity in the adult human. And that coelom is what we cut into when we're dissecting in the lab, whether it's a fetal pig or a cat or even a human cadaver. We cut through the skin, muscle, and bones of the outer tube into the coelom and reveal the organs of the inner tube. We call this outer tube of the body the parietal or somatic part of our body, and this is formed, the outer tube consists of, like I said, the somatic or parietal part of the body, the skin, the underlying skeletal muscles, the bones, and even the nerves coming off of the neural tube, the brain and spinal cord, and all of the peripheral nerves. This is the subject matter for Anatomy and Physiology 1. The inner tube, on the other hand, is what we call the visceral part of the body. It forms, of course, the digestive tract, the esophagus, stomach, and intestines. It has 3 organs pocketing off of it, the lungs, liver, and pancreas. And we include the heart and urogenital organs, or reproductive and urinary organs, renal organs, as part of the visceral part of the body, even though their formation is a little bit more complicated than to say that they just come from that inner tube. Finally, we can see that the entire coelom is lined by this very thin layer of what we call serous lining, a lubricated, thin saran wrap-like tissue that coats the entire coelomic cavity, where it coats the inside part of the outer or parietal part of the body. We call it the parietal lining, and where it covers the internal organs, we call it the visceral lining, and they connect at the back body wall, what we call the mesentery. In the chest cavity, we would call the visceral lining or the serous lining the pleura, and the abdominal cavity, we would call it the peritoneum. That, folks, then is how we get a tube within a tube embryo after gastrulation at about day 21, with everything in position to form the basic organizational plan for our adult body. An outer parietal or somatic tube of the body, which goes on to form the skin, muscle, and bones, and also the nerves, the subject of Anatomy and Physiology 1, and an inner visceral tube of the body, which goes on to form the digestive tract, lungs, liver, and pancreas coming off of that, as well as the heart and urogenital system, basically the subject matter of ANP2. That's it from Big Picture Anatomy.